On this Halloween episode of Doing the Most,
we're going to attempt to make glow-in-the-dark beer and mead.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
I've been hearing about this yeast for years. This is a gene-edited Bell saison yeast that has the jellyfish protein that glows with fluorescence under blacklight. And I was always a little bit dubious that the green glow that you see in those laboratory growth plates would actually translate to a finished beer. And so I decided I would finally pony up the money to give it a shot. So shipping included, I spent about $50 on what amounted to probably less than 2 grams of yeast. Now, the kit included all sorts of other stuff to grow the yeast on, but man, that's an investment for the hope at a green fluorescent beer. So how this works is the laboratory has already inserted the gene, the jellyfish gene, using CRISPR. That gene gives the yeast the ability to create this protein that absorbs ultraviolet light and then emits lower energy green light. So it gives it this kind of eerie, spooky green glow. Perfect for a Halloween episode. So let's rewind to the day the package arrived and take a look at what's inside. This thing shipped a lot faster than I thought it was going to, so I was not prepared to do a video on this yet, but here it is. I'm going to do a proper unboxing on it now. It specifies that it needs to be refrigerated after it opens. You gotta wonder, presumably you have to have yeast in suspension in order to make that work, so this is probably going to need to be a really quick beer, and it's probably going to need to be a beer that is bottle conditioned, so there's active yeast in there still, presumably. So we'll find out. We'll try it a few different ways and we'll see if we can make beer that glows. Happy Halloween. This is like a whole kit and this was $50. So definitely the most expensive yeast I've ever purchased. And it includes a lot of stuff. This, I think, yep. Oh. A little blacklight. I already have my own blacklight. And then this is like, I think like a science experiment type kit. And my understanding is the yeast was released under Creative Commons. So it's not even like a patented thing or anything like that. Gloves, nitrile gloves, Petri dishes, a lot of little tubes. I'm guessing this is so that you can collect your samples after you've bred your yeast in the Petri dishes and share with others. Very cool. This one is agar. I think this is the growth medium. Some pipettes. So we have all the stuff to culture the yeast just like you would if you were like a high school science student and doing this for like science fair. But I've got 2 vials of the yeast and it's freeze-dried yeast. It's like a powder. So I think what I'm going to attempt to do is use one of these vials to do just a regular old yeast starter with my stir plate. I think what I'm going to do is mix up 650 mils of starter with sterile water and dry malt extract, and then maybe put in a couple grams of Go Firm Protect. So there's a little bit more like nutrient in there. This is a very small amount of yeast. Take a look at this. Very small amount of yeast. And so we'll try and culture this gram up into enough to do a batch of beer with. We'll probably run that on the stir plate for 48 hours. And if that doesn't work, then we will save this other vial and we will go through the whole Petri dish operation. Wish me luck. To get this process started, we are using my stir plate to do a yeast starter. This yeast starter is going to be 1/3 cup of dry malt extract and water up to 650 milliliters. This is bottled water, so I know it's sterile, and it's also going to be microwaved to boil, so it will definitely be sterile by the time the yeast go in. Once that comes out of the microwave, we will stir to combine and allow that to cool to room temperature before pitching our yeast. In addition to that dry malt extract, I'm also putting a little bit of Go Firm in here, about 4 grams. And then, the moment we've all been waiting for, the yeast goes in. and it's a very tiny, tiny little amount. Make sure it all gets in there, and then let's slide in our stir bar. The stir bar is magnetic, so it attaches to the magnet spinner underneath and creates that spin for us. This will whip in a bunch of oxygen and get our starter going. So I ran down to the local homebrew shop and asked them to fix me up a grain bill for a saison, and I got to brewing. And this is just a very simple saison recipe that the local homebrew store put together for me. I did it as an all-grain batch, and I did this as a traditional all-grain batch, so not brew in a bag. I went through the whole process. It took about 5 hours total to brew everything, clean everything up, and get to actually pitching our yeast into the beer. So it was a nice, long, casual brew day. At the end of a long brew day and after a shower, I went ahead and drained that off into our carboy and checked our gravity. We were right under 1.060. Then time to pitch our yeast, and at this time there was still no sign that it was fluorescent at all, which was kind of a bummer, but I decided to go all in, pitch it in there, and see what happens. You know, maybe I was missing something. Satisfyingly, the next morning that had really taken off, so I wasn't super worried about fermentation. So I was able to culture the yeast on my stir plate and brew a beer successfully with it, and it brewed a relatively tasty, nice saison style beer. But it never glowed with fluorescence. I could not get that beer to glow under blacklight. I didn't get any glow from any point from the time I mixed up the yeast to the time I poured the beer. And so I gave up. Just kidding. I had a whole other pile of yeast left over, so I decided to do it the old-fashioned way. So I spoke to the folks from the Odin and asked for a little advice, and they said, really, you've got to culture it on these agar plates. You can't just spin it up in your stir plate. So I followed their directions, mostly using the remaining freeze-dried yeast that I had. I built these plates, and as you can see, some of it eventually began to culture. With that other vial of yeast, it was only right that we went through with the entire process of putting this onto the agar plates. So that's exactly what I did. Following the instructions, I poured in the agar solution and then measured out the right amount of water to go in there to mix with it. And then I shook it all about. And once that was all combined, I put it in the microwave to get it up to temperature. It needed to be nice and hot so everything could dissolve, but apparently it wasn't supposed to boil. So I had to really keep an eye on it to make sure that my agar was mixed and heated properly. Once that had cooled down, so it was warm, but not necessarily room temperature, it was time to pour it into our Petri dishes. So I tried to pour out an even amount in each of the Petri dishes, and I think I succeeded. They all looked about the same. Then I mixed the sterile water that came with this kit with the freeze-dried yeast, gave it a good shake, and then started dolloping it out onto the Petri dishes. And again, I was trying to make sure that I put an even amount of yeast in each of these. And then I used this little loop to spread it around. Because I kind of had no idea what I was doing, I've never done this before, I definitely punctured the agar in several places, which in some instances led to the yeast growing underneath the agar film. But I didn't worry about it. You'll see that in a little bit. So let's dim the lights a little bit and take a look at what that looks like. So if you take a look, it's so difficult to see, but there is a phosphorescence that comes out just in the middle of these cultures. From this distance, it's probably difficult to see, so I'll get some close-ups. As you can see here, I was indeed able to get it to fluoresce under blacklight. You can see just that light little bit of green in the middle. Some of them were definitely more stark than others, but I think this turned out really well. It was a cool experiment, even if I was having trouble getting it to do its thing in a brew. But now that I have seen evidence that I can get that green fluorescence out of it, it was time to scoop it off and see if we could get a brew to actually do something with it. So in wanting to get you this video by Halloween, I decided to mix up a crispy hydromel using my recipe. You can check out the link up there for more information. And this should be done pretty quick. And if we drink it kind of yeasty, hopefully we can get some of that phosphorescence. So I'm gonna scrape these plates. I'm gonna try and get only the green bits and we're gonna put them in there and see if we can't ferment some saison crispy hydromel. Very carefully, I went in and scooped out the yeast, and in some cases I peeled out the whole chunk of agar that the yeast was on, because again, I punctured it in some areas because I had no clue what I was doing. I was just trying to follow the directions, and I didn't realize the agar was going to be so fragile when I did this. But the fortunate thing is all this stuff is sterile, save for the yeast culture that's on it, so I felt okay scooping it all out and just chucking the whole thing in. And I was really trying to only get the parts that had green fluorescence. So I left a little bit of the yeast behind just because I didn't want any chance that maybe some other part of the yeast culture that was in there that wasn't expressing that fluorescence got into the brew. Now, obviously this wasn't super exact, but it was what I felt I could do at the time as kind of an insurance policy. All that went into this little crispy hydromel batch, 1 gallon batch. And I crossed my fingers that I could get it to finish within a couple of weeks. The hydromel, quote unquote, finished up at 1.005, which meant it was time to bottle it because I was going to be bottling in pet-nat style, which meant I needed to sweeten it up with about 1/3 of a cup of erythritol first. Erythritol is non-fermentable, so it would allow it to continue to be sweet while the yeast continued to chew through the rest of the fermentable sugars. In order to get this mead sparkling quickly, we're going to do something called pet-nat, or pétillant naturel. Basically, what we're going to do is bottle it when it hits 1.005 on the hydrometer. Now, yes, this is going to leave some sediment in the bottle, and that's characteristic to this style. But what it's going to do is maintain some of the CO2 that's already in suspension in that brew, as well as store up all the rest of that CO2 that the yeast is going to create, finishing up fermentation. So it's going to carbonate in the bottle, very similar to what would happen if you used priming sugar and bottle condition that way. So hopefully we will get this done in time for Halloween. So I racked it, added the sweetener, and then bottled it. And again, this is going to continue fermenting in the bottles until it's all the way done, and that carbonation should be just enough to leave it pétillant in the bottle. Pet-nat is not a style I've ever done before, but it felt like this was the right time to experiment with this process. I was really pressed for time trying to get this video out. This was made with the CRISPR modified fluorescent yeast. We're going to take a look and see exactly how this looks under blacklight. As you can see, even doing pet-nat style, it cleared out beautifully. What I'm going to do is pour 2 glasses. One, I'm going to pour half of it in there. The other, I'm going to stir up the dregs and pour it in there so you can see what this looks like under blacklight. As you can see, pet-nat worked really well to get us a nice, pétillant, and crispy mead. Let's hit the lights. As you can see, neither has a really discernible glow. Now, honey itself tends to glow a little bit yellow under blacklight, so you're seeing just a little bit of that in the mead, but it's not really a fluorescence, especially not that bright green fluorescence that you see online when you see pictures of this yeast, or like what you saw in our growth medium. So this experiment was a total bust. But like the scientists that we are, let's press on. Determined not to let my struggles with the CRISPR gene-edited yeast get me down, I turned to the internet to look for some other natural ways of making a fluorescent mead or beer. I came across 2 things that might work. The first is tonic water. Tonic water includes a compound called quinine, and quinine glows under blacklight. Quinine does this basically in the same way the gene-edited yeast do. It absorbs the UV light and then emits a soft blue light back. Quinine was originally developed as a medicine and anti-malarial. It comes from the bark of a certain tree and it's quite bitter. So soldiers would mix it with water to get it down, and then they just started mixing it with gin to make it even more palatable, and that's where you get the gin and tonic. To test quinine, we went a couple of different routes. We actually bought quinine, the liquid extract. It's this brown kind of soupy extract that you can put in drinks. It's liquid quinine extract. And we tried tonic water. We found that the quinine extract, this stuff does not work. It does not create a glow no matter how heavily you concentrate it in liquid. But tonic water, with the way they synthesize the quinine for that, works pretty well for cocktails and other drinks. So I had hope that we could find a way to make that work. The other method the internet suggested was to use vitamin B, and we tried both vitamin B1 and vitamin B2, and we found that vitamin B2, riboflavin, works really well to get a yellow glow. And the reason riboflavin glows under blacklight is because when the blacklight hits that, it excites the molecules and it actually causes them to emit their own light. It's a slightly different way than you get fluorescence out of, say, that yeast or the tonic water. What's cool about that is for cocktails or punches or other mixed drinks, you can actually add food coloring with the riboflavin and get different colors other than that yellow glow. But what we were really looking for here was a green glow. So we're hoping to use some of the elements of quinine, that blue glow, and some of the elements of B2, riboflavin, that yellow glow, to create a green glow. We'll see how well that works. I bought a bunch of tonic water because tonic water includes quinine. I have two different experiments here that I worked on this day. One was boiling down a bunch of tonic water to create a tonic syrup. The other experiment was to mix up a mead using tonic water instead of regular old spring water. And that would mean that this had plenty of quinine in it and hopefully would lead to some fluorescence. And this is the first mead I've ever made where I felt the need to degas it before I pitched my yeast. And this here is just a starter of EC1118 going right on in. And here's me hoping for the best. Once the bubbles in the boiling tonic water started to look kind of sticky like sugar syrup, I took it off the heat and this is what I was left with. I then poured that into this graduated cylinder here and allowed it to cool. My hope being that I could use this as a way of dosing a finished mead to see what kind of fluorescence it might produce. And as a syrup, it was pretty difficult to tell whether or not it was having any effect. But I was hopeful. I threw a little cheesecloth over the top and allowed that to cool. Back in the lab, it was time to mix up some of this quinine-dense tonic syrup into a finished mead. I just happened to have a gallon of finished mead laying around, so I racked it off and left a little headspace for this procedure. This stuff poured really slowly, and I ended up using about 1/4 cup of that and about 1/4 cup of water to turn this into a liquid. But before that, I decided to add a riboflavin capsule. So this is 400 milligrams of riboflavin that I crushed up into a powder and then added, and then I used about 1/4 cup of water to rinse out the mortar and pestle, and then I added that in and got it all mixed to combine. Then I set up my blacklight to try and at least kind of get an idea for how this is going to work. The blacklight was a little bit too close to the carboy, but it'll give you an idea of the efficacy here. I turned out the lights in the studio and held my breath, and we had glowing mead. I love this kind of ghastly effect. Swirled it up, and with the blacklight a little further back, you can get a much better understanding of what this looks like in a room full of blacklight. And over there is the tonic water mead still fermenting. You can see it is a nice fluorescent blue. So we're finally getting somewhere with this experiment. In the end, we placed all of our hope in the tonic water brewed mead using riboflavin at bottling. So here's what that looks like, and when it's done, we'll be back here for a look and a tasting. So again, we were ready to bottle at 1.005, which meant there was a little bit of remaining fermentable sugar in there, and again, we're sweetening with erythritol. I mixed the erythritol into a syrup with some boiled water, and then covered that and let it cool for a bit while I mashed up my riboflavin tablet. Now I learned from my previous experiment with this that it's important to sift your tablet because there are some little bits of the shell of the tablet that don't dissolve. So I sifted those through, pressed those through, and you can see there, that is what got discarded. The rest of that riboflavin dust goes in, and I racked on top of that. After I racked to get a nice clean rack off the sediment that had accumulated, I went ahead and added that syrup and gave it a couple of swirls to make sure everything was mixed throughout. And then I just bottled as you typically would in these bottles and allowed them to carbonate. All right, it's been a couple of days. The tonic water mead is ready to go. So let's open it up, let's dim the lights, and let's see what we came up with. That is a glow-in-the-dark mead, if I do say so myself. Beautiful, bright green glow. Honestly, I am wildly pleased with the results from this experiment. But I guess the most important part in all of this, beyond that beautiful green glow, is how does it taste? It tastes like a tonic water mead. Interesting. Yeah, the tonic water flavor is really there. It almost a little bit tastes like a gin and tonic. Just doesn't have that real juniper thing going on in it, but it definitely has a tonic water flavor. I could see wanting to back sweeten this just a little bit more. I think the acid balance on this is really nice, and I think I'm prepared to make a recipe recommendation on this. Who'd have thunk? Glow-in-the-dark mead with vitamin B and tonic water. That's doing the most. So even without the blacklight on, this is still a really wild colored mead. Honestly, flavor not too bad. Not too bad. Again, a little bit like a gin and tonic. Super interesting. Really an interesting experiment, and I'm glad we finally got to something that we believe really works, and to something where the flavor on it is actually relatively pleasant as well. Man, it's such an unusual flavor profile, but still really good. Especially for someone like me who really likes a good gin and tonic. That tonic flavor really permeates well. I'm into this. So a couple great things about this. Tonic syrup is available. It's a thing that's sold, and you can typically find it in grocery stores or bar supply stores near where like the grenadine and other things like that are sold. So you could use a little bit of tonic syrup in place of using tonic water. And of course, vitamin B, B2, that is, riboflavin is obviously sold like as a medicine. It's sold wherever you get your pharmaceutical stuff. And one thing I will quick point out about riboflavin is it needs to be added at bottling, because apparently it is UV sensitive, and so you want to, once you've added it, store it in dark brown bottles so that way the UV light doesn't break it down inside of your brew. And so this is really accessible. Both of those things, riboflavin and tonic syrup, could be added to a finished mead if you wanted to, or a finished beer, and produce probably a relatively similar green glow as to what we were able to get. Both of those things in combination should be able to produce a beautiful green glow like we got in this session mead. So riboflavin, tonic syrup, add them to a finished brew, you're probably going to get something fairly similar to this. But of course, we do have our recipe for this Halloween Hide Glow Mel. And that recipe is here on the screen. And you can just screenshot this, but this is what we would recommend if you would like to brew a gallon batch of this on your own. Now, I will caveat all of this by saying that quinine is technically used as a medicine. Vitamin B2 obviously is a medical supplement. So maybe consult your doctor if you feel you need to around making sure there's not any interactions with other medications you're on or anything like that, or maybe don't need riboflavin in your diet. But These things are technically considered food safe, and so I'm happy to recommend them for a glowing homebrew like we have here. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive exploration. Of course, you can follow us on all the things, including joining our Discord server. And thank you for subscribing. If you haven't subscribed, do that right now. And then go click that bell icon so you'll get notifications about our upcoming videos. In closing, happy Halloween, stay safe out there, and cheers.